So I'm going to be learning here because I haven't followed the issue really carefully like you have, but it's a big issue, and I'm becoming convinced it's really got an awful lot of dangers involved with the way things are going now.
I think it does.
Yeah,
so
it really,
we'll talk. We'll have a conversation.
Yeah, we'll have a conversation about it. Right. I'm glad we could get over here. And, welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Charles Adler, and he's the president of the Voluntary Committee of Lawyers, Incorporated, which is an organization concerned with drug policy in a broad sense. And welcome very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, not at all. It's my pleasure to welcome you to MNN. We're going to be talking about drug policy and problems and so forth, I guess on a national scale, maybe international, I don't know. We're going to talk about this issue. But I wonder, maybe you could, we have some time, maybe you could share your own background, if you would, where you hail from, that sort of thing, and then maybe weave it into how you became interested in this particular issue, and then we can talk about
Very good.
The important problem.
I hail from New York, and I've been a practicing criminal lawyer in New York for, afraid to say, it's almost 30 years, I guess.
They creep up, don't they?
They sure do.
Yeah.
And some time ago, I began to notice that most of the cases in the courts, not necessarily mine, involved drugs in one way or another.
Really?
And the more I noticed that, the more I saw that cases that don't seem to involve drugs do involve drugs.
Interesting, yeah.
And as I started to notice that, I also started to notice that the criminal justice system was doing nothing to improve the situation. And it then became more and more apparent that not only was it not helping, it seemed to be hurting.
Really?
And I began having some conversations with people, and it's one of those issues that you don't really think about. You assume that there's only one side to it. But once I got involved in thinking and talking about it, I saw there were other sides. It was a very complex issue. And I've come to the conclusion that it needs to be looked at a good deal more seriously than it has. That led me to begin an association, which has been very interesting and congenial, with a group of people. Tom Haynes, who's chair of biochemistry at CUNY Medical School, his wife Polly Cleveland, an economist, and I and a group of other people began an organization some years ago called the Partnership for Responsible Drug Information, whose task it was to see that accurate, reliable information was available to the media and to others. And sometime later, another group began called the Voluntary Committee of Lawyers. Let me tell you just a bit about what that is.
All right.
In the 1920s, a group of very prominent attorneys at the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, which is the major bar association here, began an effort to put the question of prohibition and its possible repeal on the national agenda.
Right.
And so we have modeled ourselves after that. It's a group that seeks to put the issue before the organized bar, before the legal community. We're not an advocacy group. We have no particular conclusion as to how drug policy ought to change, just that we think it probably should. And we think that lawyers are a particularly well-suited group to look at the issue. And so we foster the development of committees and bar associations around the country. Among our founding members are Elliot Richardson, Nicholas Katzenbach, the late and unfortunately recently deceased Leon Higginbotham is among our founding members. Sam Dash is on our board of advisors. So we have a group of very prominent lawyers who agree that it is an issue worth discussing. And so I'm delighted to be here to discuss it with you.
Well, I'm delighted to have a conversation with you on this subject, which really has ramifications that are very important in this country and on a world scale. And I've gotten some of the literature larger than I had realized because I, like you suggested, didn't tend to think about it and so forth. It's interesting, the Volunteer Committee at the Volstead Act, or looking at prohibition, was, maybe we could talk about that, because that's the organization you're involved with. They were looking at the issue, of course, of the repeal of prohibition of alcohol.
That's right.
I don't know, Did the Volstead Act involve others, or what is the history of, if you may, or weave that in a little, with the history of the prohibition of the ingestion of psychotropic or other kinds of substances by the citizenry? There was a time when there was nothing. Coca-Cola used to be made with coca, if I understand.
That's correct.
And so forth. So maybe if you could weave that in a little bit and then relate to it. The Volstead Act was only one particular substance, which was alcohol, or were there other substances that were involved in a more, you know, overall policy that they were trying to have changed?
No, it involved alcohol.
That's it. Okay.
It's interesting as you look at the history of prohibition.
Yes.
Of, as you say, psychoactive or psychotropic substances. The history is quite interesting and often is very closely connected to current feelings about particular groups.
Interesting.
The prohibition and the uproar surrounding opium was very much associated with the increased immigration of Chinese who came to this country.
Okay, yeah.
Marijuana prohibition is largely associated with our views at the time of Mexican immigrants.
When did that come into account? I mean, into effect?
In the 30s.
In the 30s it was, right? It was legal until then?
Yes, it was.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, interesting.
There are articles, if you go back and look at some of the newspaper accounts in the South, I don't recall the exact time period, but in this century, probably in the 30s or 40s, there were actual newspaper accounts saying that blacks or coloreds were made bulletproof by the use of cocaine. So that there's
racial kind of
yeah, it's really hard to get away from the notion of other, whoever the other happens to be at any particular time. Drugs and the other seem to go together pretty closely.
So there's a stereotyping that goes along with this, or has, right?
There always has.
But in the case of the Volstead Act, and prior to that, in the 19th century, there were drugs. Of course, we have a much wider variety of drugs and so forth now. But drugs were readily available. They used to have these tonics and things like that and so forth.
Readily available and very popular.
Sure,
they were sold all over as tonics and cures for just about everything.
The concerns that we have now, or let's say the people who say no to drugs, the established sort of view now, what was the attitude of the people who were responsible for those kind of established views then, vis-a-vis the drugs that existed? Drugs were legal then, drugs were able to be available.
Sure.
Now we have a tremendous constituency of people, McCaffrey and so forth, and these people who are very vociferously against it. What was the attitude of the people of the 19th century that were in positions of authority toward drugs that were being freely distributed and so forth, and what happened that there was a change in terms of so many of these establishment-minded people to take a different kind of view than that which was prevalent in the 19th century?
Well, the most significant of those changes, of course, was the Volstead Act, was the issue of alcohol prohibition. The temperance movement had a lot to do with the idea of women who felt that their husbands were not taking care of the families and were hanging out in the bars and so on.
And a lot of them were.
And a lot of them were.
Right, and it's got a price to pay. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then, interestingly, one of the things that seemed to turn that around in the public view was that after Prohibition came into effect, people continued to find places to consume alcohol, and those people tended to be now some of the children of the families who were very much in favor of prohibiting alcohol.
Right.
And,
interesting. Yeah.
And that in some way has been the history of prohibition. That the intent of ending the use of a substance doesn't accomplish the intended result, but shifts the patterns of use in ways that are more destructive than the original patterns.
Yeah, I saw in some of the literature that was sent is that it did go down slightly, but then all of the what do you call bootlegging and so forth came into effect, and it really didn't drop tremendously. The use of it during the Prohibition and actual numbers of consumption of alcohol after Prohibition and so forth.
It dropped for a short time
Yeah,
and
short
then
period,
picked
yeah.
up, but it also changed. Where we used to be much more a beer and wine consuming nation, a beer consuming nation more, we became a nation of hard distilled alcohol and spirits after Prohibition.
Stuff that could be made up in the still in the back 40.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you're going to be involved in an illegal business, the incentive is to create more powerful substances. That's another one of the effects that seem to be universal in Prohibition.
More bang for the buck.
More bang for the buck,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, that's interesting. But then the town father or the national fathers and so forth, who now they take such umbrage at the idea of these drugs and so forth. It was a laissez-faire attitude towards drugs. Let's say back before Volstead, before the temperance movement got its wheels going really strongly. But there were other drugs. There had been long-standing drugs that were available, and was that an international pattern? That drugs were just I don't want to say a drug on the market, but they were just able to be freely circulated, because we now have a medical establishment. We now have the medical use, and it's a very rigid system of distributing or allowing these things to be available. It's a big change from having things generally available and open to the choice of people to have access to what it is they want, to one that is so highly restricted now.
Sure.
And I wasn't thinking of specifically the act so much as the mentality behind it, national mentality.
Well, as you say, cocaine was one of the, or coca derivative was one of the ingredients of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, sure,
back then.
absolutely. Yeah, right. Yeah, and so it was there and was accepted, yeah.
Sure it was.
So there was a change, as I'm saying, in the national and international attitude toward substances which had been allowed to circulate in the society,
Surely.
and to one where they wanted to have this strict restriction upon it,
Surely.
and turn it into an immoral, illegal, thing.
Until today, where it's extraordinarily demonized.
No, demonized is the right word. It is now, yeah.
And it's not a something that just developed on its own. There's been a great deal of effort devoted on the part of government, of the purveyors of the policy of prohibition, to demonize drugs, to demonize those who use drugs, in ways that, more perhaps to the point of our problem today, in ways that cut off real discussion and prevent us from taking good and intelligent looks at a policy that has serious and widespread repercussions.
Right, okay, yeah, and that's what we're trying to do here. And there should be conversations such as this among people of responsible concern about this particular issue, because there's tremendous, as they say, downside to the pattern that we have now, and we want to discuss that and so forth. We do have much more, a wider array. I mean, alcohol is a drug. Actually, I guess everything is chemical in a certain sense if you look at things comprehensively, but there's been a huge development of new drugs, new psychotropic and other kinds of drug things existent. The pharmaceutical industry has grown, there's all kinds of it, so that we have a much more complex kind of world, and we have a greater understanding of the actual working of the human brain and so forth, and the effects that these drugs do have on the neurotransmitters that we didn't even know about 20 years ago or something. So things have developed tremendously. But this idea of their people ingesting something that's going to change, what is it? Is it changing of the consciousness is what the society is particularly concerned about? You have a medical profession that will prescribe penicillin for something, or an antibiotic or something, and that you understand medically and so forth. But could you change?
Or morphine?
Or morphine would, but then the morphine has something that would be, there's a term recreational use or something? Maybe you could spell this out. I mean, the medical use and then the non-medical kind of use of what we mean by, and what are we talking about when we talk about drugs?
Oh, I think that's a wonderful question, Harold. What do we mean when we talk about drugs? Tobacco contains nicotine.
It sure does. It's addicting.
It's highly addicting.
Yeah.
It is probably among the most addicting drugs. It seems to be undisputed that it kills about 400,000 people a year in this country. And yet, until very recently, it hasn't been the subject of much discussion. Now it's beginning to
Now
be.
it's very al current to be against it.
It is
even
indeed.
in polite society or in established society.
But we still subsidize the industry.
Yeah, but there is a strong movement against it, you know, now. But anyway, yes.
But it seems to me it's a psychoactive substance. I'm not much of a tobacco smoker. I smoke a pipe occasionally, but I've had a couple of cigars.
Did you inhale?
I did inhale.
A cigar?
I was sorry I did.
Yeah, that's right.
I found that I got dizzy.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to people who smoke tobacco products regularly. And after a bit of conversation, it does seem that one of the things they like about it is the effect it has on them that's related in a way, or seems subjectively, it sounds like it's related to a glass of wine or alcohol. I know that there are people who, if they don't have a cup of coffee in the morning, just can't get started in the day.
Guilty.
I'm afraid I'm among them as well.
Yeah.
We tend to dismiss that, but somewhere on the spectrum, that's a psychoactive, psychotropic drug.
Yeah.
But we don't have the same set of responses to it.
Does the word drug have a loaded connotation or something when we use it? You say nicotine, or if you say caffeine, is it drug? I mean, because everything is, in a certain sense, chemical. Tom would know. Everything's biochemical, even down to the cells in our body. Right. So in a certain sense, everything is. But when we use that word, is there's a connotation that would try to put some of the things outside, sugar or something, you know, outside of the pale of considering, you know, what we mean when we say drug?
Oh, sure there is. And even if we don't go so far afield as to include sugar, in what are clearly drugs, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, the derivatives of the coca plant, cocaine, crack cocaine, the derivatives of the opium plant, morphine, heroin, and the synthetics.
Not to mention the designer drugs.
Not to mention the designer drugs. Those are clearly drugs. I mean, everybody who talks about this issue would understand that they are drugs.
So also is penicillin and streptomycin, and these are drugs.
I think that's of a different sort.
Okay. Maybe that's the distinction I was trying to get at. Yeah.
I mean, those there is no recreational use that I'm aware of.
No, the only dialectic might be of something should be over the counter, you need a prescription, but then you got the doctors community intervening in terms of allowing certain things being available to people in the name of medical good practice or something, so that the people presumably would not harm themselves by using these powerful substances. I guess that's the rationale behind just letting any drug be available to anybody on any terms that they want. Well,
in the legal setting, we talk about controlled substances.
Yeah, okay.
And there are a number of schedules of controlled substances. There's Schedule 1, which are those substances that are susceptible to abuse but have no legitimate medical use. That's Schedule 1. Schedule 2 are substances available, susceptible to abuse but have some medical use. Cocaine has a medical use. It's used in dentistry. It's used in obstetrics. But if we talk only about those substances that can be abused, let's assume that those that have a recreational use and are subject to abuse, and if we list them all and we try to distinguish those that are illegal from those that are legal, and look for some principled way to understand why some are legal and some are not.
Yes, that's I guess what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
My experience is it's very difficult.
Okay.
I mean, take for example, if we draw a line down a piece of paper and we put the legal substances on one side, the illegal on the other. On the legal side, you have tobacco.
Yeah.
You have alcohol.
Now it was illegal.
It was at one time, but now it's legal. On the other side, let's say you put marijuana, heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine,
LSD,
And we ask ourselves, what distinguishes those that are on the legal side from the illegal side? What's the principle?
Right. Okay.
If you look at addictiveness,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't work. We've talked about how addictive nicotine is, tobacco is. That's on the legal side.
Mm-hmm.
There are many different attitudes expressed about marijuana, but nobody says that it's addictive.
Mm-hmm.
That's on the illegal side.
It is on the illegal side. So that's not the criteria by which these
So
things are on the illegal
addictiveness
side.
doesn't seem to explain it.
Okay.
So then perhaps we look at potential for harm,
Mm-hmm.
association with violence. Let's look at that.
Mm-hmm.
The drug most associated with violence is alcohol.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think pretty much everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
So that's not a criterion that explains the difference between those that are on the legal side and those that are on the illegal side.
Okay.
I'm still looking for an
Oh,
explanation.
you're still looking.
I'm
I
still
thought
looking.
you were going to come to the conclusion, Counselor, about what is the distinction, but
There
you
is
can't
none.
come one, right?
There really is none.
Yeah. There's a thing, and we will talk about it. We want to talk and elaborate on that. But the idea of addiction and so forth, we once did it way back before, in maybe 10 years ago, we did a program with Timothy Leary, who was all involved with drugs in the 60s and so forth and everything. And he came up and he said that across the line in certain cultural groups, there are people that have a genetic predisposition or something of that sort to, they call them addictive personalities. There are people that are addictive personalities. They can be addicted to sugar or sweets or something like that. And he said it's about 10% of the population. I don't know if you've seen this figure, that there are people who tend to have a difficulty in reining in the use of something. Like tobacco. If you were to smoke cigarettes, it's different. They just say somebody's a smoker if they smoke a half a cigarette a day as opposed to 5 packages. It is different. It's not, you don't understand what I'm saying? It's minimum. Or in the case of alcohol, if you smoke, if you have 1 or 2 glasses of wine a day, this is recommended by your cardiologist and so forth. If you drink a couple of fifths of vodka a day, like Mr. Yeltsin did on some occasions, very disquieting with all those MIRV nuclear warheads and so forth. But if you do, you've got a real problem if you do it continually. You understand? Is there a distinction on that about the use? And the thing that Mr. Leary said was that there are many people who use these drugs that are, if you're addictive, are disastrous because you go down a very slippery slope to a Bowery bum kind of situation of the addicted personality would end up, but that doesn't apply to maybe 90% of the people. They can handle it. Is this something you run into?
Yeah,
or something?
I think
is there
that's right.
a problem that we have an image of anybody who uses any part of a piece of a drug is going to end up the way the most extreme example is the addictive personality is going to, and therefore we build upon that one model that represents maybe only 10% of the population don't relate to the other 10, or this question of moderation.
I think that's right. It came as a surprise to me to learn from people who are very authoritative, people who are in this field, that even with heroin, it's only about 12% of people who experiment with heroin who become really addicted to it.
Okay. That's interesting. That's close to that 10% figure.
It's not far from
Mr. Leary said it was across the board, across the world, and cross-cultural studies and so forth. It just seemed to be something genetic.
And then there are those people who the first time they ever take a drink of alcohol can't stop drinking. Right. And can't stop for the rest of their lives.
Now that's got something to do that isn't universal. That's something to do on a personal level. Maybe it could be treated that way or something. I don't know. It's just maybe it's a side issue or not, but I'm not sure.
No, I think it's very much at the heart of the issue.
And particularly now, we just did a program, if I may, last week with this some of the things on genetic engineering and so forth. There might be some new capabilities of dealing with genetic malfunctioning gene or something that causes that kind of thing. So we might be able to treat that medically or something like that. That addictive problem that we've taken as the model for all use of any drug. I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking about these things in broad terms.
I think it goes to the heart of the issue in 2 particular ways.
Okay.
One is there is no real, accurate, reliable information out there among the public about these things. There are so many myths.
Yes.
The notion that's probably prevalent is that anyone who experiments with any hard drug will almost certainly become immediately addicted to it. It's not true.
It's not true in 90% of the case, apparently.
That's exactly correct. Is it a dangerous thing to do?
Yeah.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
You might be in
Yeah.
that 10%.
And are some of those things more inclined toward that? I mean, some of the drugs more inclined toward encouraging some latent addictive quality in a person than others. Some are perhaps more than others.
Well, I think
or not,
the data is more or less as you suggest, that
Oh, really?
that addictive personalities who become exposed to psychoactive substances tend to become addicted.
Yeah.
Those who are not among those people tend not to.
Okay.
Many of them grow out of it. So the first question is, why is it
Yeah.
that the information is so distorted?
Why is it, in your experience?
Because we don't have these conversations, because there are very strong motivations to maintain our policy at all costs.
Okay. Now,
Our policy is described as a war.
yes, that's right. It is a war on Mr. McIver you're talking about. or
Well, it
Mr.
goes
Reagan.
back before that.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And when you have a war,
Yes.
it's not really...
Take no prisoners.
You
huh?
take no prisoners.
Yeah.
And it doesn't invite
Uh-huh.
discussion about why we're having the war
Yeah.
and whether perhaps the enemy isn't so bad.
Yeah.
Or isn't what we make him out to
Or it
be.
isn't worth the price we pay to fight it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's treasonous kind of talk.
Okay.
And that's part of the problem. It has put us in a position where we continue a policy, which we'll talk about a little bit more as to how it's having adverse consequences.
Yes, by
in
all
many
means,
ways.
let's spell that out.
But one of the reasons we have the policy, despite the fact that it seems to be going in the wrong direction, is that we prevent real information from getting out there. So that's one of the ways I think that it's important. It goes to the issue, why is it that the people don't understand this about drugs? Because
we prevent it. When you say we, you mean the society in
We, the
general and
society.
the media and so forth? And yeah, okay.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because we don't have these conversations. These
Yeah.
conversations are not part of the mainstream media discussion.
Anybody who would try to take that stand is sort of like a scapegoated somebody in the days of McCarthy who wanted to talk about
I think that's exactly
or
right.
something,
I
or
think
even
that's
talk
exactly
about
right.
yeah, okay.
I think
It's a-
demonized is a good word for it.
Yeah, the dialectic other, 1984. Remember 1984?
I do indeed.
They used to talk about how they would shift
Used to
the
be in the
line.
future.
Yeah, yeah, they used, yeah, that's right. And it used to be in the future. That's interesting. But they had Oceania, and they'd be against one person, one group the next 1 week, and then they would shift the alliances. Everybody was supposed to go "Rawr," and do like that kind of thing. They shift around, and people did do that. And it, it's interesting to me also. I was just talking to I can remember, and you probably can also, when it used to be, if it's a moral issue that they're going to try and raise. I don't know. We maybe should get to that, but maybe before I forget this, is it used to be. I can remember people, like some of them are up in Harlem and things like that, they used to put them up and lock them up, and there were huge ad campaigns against gambling. And gambling was something that was going to destroy the family, tear people apart, and this sort of thing. And it was at a moral level that they did, on the scapegoating kind of level.
Right.
They would show the person who was gambling, and some poor guy's running a couple numbers up there and something like that or something. They'd lock them up and everything. And now the state's in the business of
Right.
gambling.
It's also
and
still in the
they're
business of
now
prosecuting gamblers who are not part of the state gambling
Oh, okay.
apparatus.
Well, you would be aware of that. But what I'm saying is the shift in morality, the shift in focus on that particular issue, which was very black and white in the minds of many people, and with some justification, but it just came to my mind. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get off
Well,
track.
that's another one of the reasons why the issue is not data-driven,
Uh-huh.
because to many people it is a moral question.
Okay.
It's then
This irrationality,
the irrationality, the
is
data-
morally based, you
I
think?
think it is.
Okay.
The other consequence
Mm-hmm.
of the fact that there's a misunderstanding about the consequences of using or trying drugs, that the problems, the real problems, and they are terribly serious problems, affect a relatively small number of people, is that we don't treat them as innocent. We treat them as people who are to be demonized. If we understood as a society that there is some percentage, 10 or 12 or 14% of our population who are in danger of becoming addicted to whatever substance they happen to choose, whether it's alcohol or what is currently an illegal drug, then we might have a different view towards drugs in general, and a more compassionate view towards those people who get caught up in addiction. Treat them as people with a disease.
All right. Now, why don't we go to where they just say no. Just have everybody say no. These drugs are bad. If you take that position, that's a drug that all drugs are bad. You're born with a good, presumably you're born with a body, and except for medical use, it is just as a moral issue wrong for you to do anything like that, and just take that position as a strong moral stance. That's the position that we, in a certain sense, officially take. And
yes and no. We don't take that with regard to alcohol at the moment.
At the moment, right. We don't do that in regard to alcohol at the moment, right. And that was based on a political reality, and why is it that we made an exception with alcohol, coffee, tobacco, and I don't know about firearms, but
That's a good question. That goes back to my inability to distinguish on any principled basis the legal from the illegal substances. I think that there are good explanations as to why we have such a strong, relentless prohibitionist policy. I don't think we can relate those stances to a particular substance in any principled way. But some of the reasons I think we have such a strong view about drugs, whatever we decide to call drugs, is that it's a very useful issue for people to talk about. It stands as a surrogate for a lot of things. It stands as a surrogate for crime. I mean, just imagine somebody who's running for office, whether he's trying to maintain his office or he's running to obtain an office. It's a very useful issue to talk about crime and drugs.
Yes, they come trippingly off the tongue, don't they?
Don't they?
And it's reflected in the prison population, as I understand.
It is indeed.
In the increasingly privatized and fastest growing industry in the country, or
Absolutely.
something which,
I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it. But when you talk about drugs, it means different things to different people.
Right, right.
To most people, it means whatever they're most afraid of. To most people, to white America in the suburbs, when you talk about drugs, they think of a very dark face with a very violent look on it and a very dangerous set of attitudes and behaviors.
Okay.
That's what they picture.
That's drugs.
That's drugs.
Right, and it's really anthropologically based. Yeah, I see, right, okay, yeah.
The reality is that drug use is pretty standard, pretty consistent across all the different communities that we have in this country. Whites, African Americans, Hispanics, all use drugs at approximately the same rate.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. And social economic levels too, or no?
No, not so much.
Okay, okay.
But if you look at the prison population, to pick up on a point that you raised, it's, first of all, most of our prison population is becoming, people who are in for drug offenses.
Right. That's what I understand.
And it's growing. It's growing tremendously.
And the rate of the percentage of drug-related things is growing.
It is indeed.
And you'd be in a position to know that.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
60% of the federal prison population is made up of people who are there for drug offenses.
60%?
60%.
And they have these mandatory sentencing things now for people with drugs because it's politically expedient to push this issue. It's a politically good issue to get it into office and so forth. Because it touches upon the fears and stereotypes of so much of the population.
Exactly.
Okay.
No politician gets into trouble being hard on drugs.
Really? Okay.
Soft on drugs can be a problem.
Yeah, right. Or drugs and crime,
Drugs and crime.
Okay.
They're interchangeable.
Right, yeah.
In the language.
Right, right.
They're not interchangeable in reality, which is something that we need to talk about. Of the prison population who are there for drug-related offenses, they are 95% from minority communities.
Really? Good Lord.
And what is the explanation for that? What is the justification for that?
You're on the battlements all the time. What is the justification for that?
And just to put out, what are the consequences of that?
All right, yeah.
Okay. The consequences, let me start with that because I think it's most important.
Okay.
The consequences are that 1 in 3 young African Americans are today under the control of the criminal justice system. They're either in prison, on parole, or on probation.
Good. I mean, is that on a national level?
Yes.
Well, you're right.
In addition to that, they've been disenfranchised.
Yeah,
You're
right.
convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote.
There you go. Yeah, right.
We have many millions of minority members who've lost their right to vote. We have undoubtedly a rising and justifiable feeling in the minority communities that they are the victims of a process, a system that is disproportionately sending their people to prison for conduct that is not enforced in the white community. And that's all true.
It's true.
It is true.
It's not a perception, it's the truth.
It's a perception, it's growing, it has terribly corrosive effects on people's sense of justice, and it's true. How does it come to pass? I don't think anybody sat down and said, how are we going to incarcerate African Americans at high rates? I don't think anybody said that. I think the policy wasn't intended to be racist, but it really is in effect, in consequence, in result, it is a racist policy.
Is the racist policy reflect a social economic reality? I mean, it's a prejudicial thing against the poor, or the people at the lower social economic level.
Sure, and the poor are disproportionately represented among minorities.
Right.
It is easier to enforce drug laws against people whose conduct, all their conduct, they live their lives more publicly. They're out on the street. They're not in their living rooms. Transactions take place on the street. They're more densely populated communities.
Right, right. Whereas the guys down on Wall Street or in the suburbs are more sequestered.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Now, let's move in, perhaps, using that into discussions of how the criminal justice system works with respect to the enforcement of drug laws, because that's a very interesting topic that people don't understand. Not their fault; it's not out there. One of the principles I think we need to understand is that you cannot enforce drug laws in the same way you enforce other criminal laws. They are different.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. The traditional kind of police activity is someone calls the police and says there's been a murder, there's been a burglary, there's been a rape, a bank has been robbed. And the police show up, they interview witnesses, they look for fingerprints, they look for other forensic evidence, ballistics evidence, and so on. And then they try to work back and find who did it. You can't enforce drug laws that way. Nobody calls the police and says, I just bought drugs, or I just sold drugs, or I possess drugs because I want to use them. So drug enforcement has to proceed in very intrusive ways. Eavesdropping, the use of informants, the use of undercover sting operations. Let me tell you what a sting operation is. And this is really sort of the standard garden variety federal drug case in the New York area now.
And this is we should keep in mind, this is an initiative on the part of federal or of agencies and so forth that could be not only in the drug but could be applied to the society in a more general pattern. It's teaching skills of the state operating in a way that could be very obtrusive against the liberties of the people in general of our society.
Well, exactly,
Yeah.
because the way, as I say,
not in any way to isolate them, but you understand, yeah.
Yeah, I mean
there's a danger.
What drug enforcement has resembles is more the enforcement of political conformity. And as we talk about how you enforce a drug law, you'll see that that whether you're looking for drugs in a person's glove compartment or you're looking for a book that you don't...
By James Joyce or something.
By James Joyce or
right.
Karl Marx
Yeah,
or such a thing, the techniques are the same. And they are different than looking for a burglar or a rapist or a robber.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
You need to get into their private places. You need to overhear their conversations. We have an army of informants in this country that grow out of our drug enforcement. As I was saying, the garden variety drug case in the federal district courts in New York is someone is arrested. He got arrested in the same way, but we have to start somewhere in talking about it. Someone's arrested and charged with the conspiracy to distribute narcotics, cocaine, heroin, whatever it happens to be. And he's told that he's facing an extraordinarily long prison term, very often life in prison, very often a mandatory minimum of 10 years or 20 years. It's terribly frightening. And what he's told is there's only one way to get out of that, and that is to work to cooperate with the government, to set up somebody else.
Right.
So that person then goes out and doesn't offer to buy drugs. It's interesting. He offers to sell drugs. What we call a reverse thing. And so at some point down the road, he will call his handling agent and say, someone is coming tonight to a particular time and place, and he's willing to purchase drugs. And the agents show up. The informant is wearing a tape recording device, and they talk about the transaction in which that person is there to purchase drugs, and he's arrested. We know very little often about how he got there, what the informant told him, why he came there with money.
The background.
The background. All of that is kind of hidden.
Much less the broader policy implications of how the society ought to be set up at a policy level. Yeah, right.
It also, I mean, it has consequences in a community when the people in the community understand that it is saturated with informants who are doing everything they can to entice other people to make drug deals or to be willing to become involved in a discussion of a drug deal. And the consequence is that person goes to prison, and the person who set him up is relieved of the need to go to prison, or his prison term is reduced.
But he's still also vulnerable to those pressures and so forth like that. It's a kind of thing like that. We talk about this on the society side, I mean on the established society side and so forth. What about it is, as I understand it, you could fill me in a little bit, it's a huge business, as I understand.
It's extraordinarily large business.
The trafficking and the distribution of these illegal drugs
Sure it
is really huge, and it's crime-related, and so it creates, as in the case of prohibition, it creates a crime element, and that crime element has come to fill our prisons to where we're now. It's the fastest-growing industry in the United States, I think. They're growing prisons to incarcerate people, and so maybe you could talk a little bit about the economic dimensions of that side of it. And is there a group at that point who has an interest in maintaining things the way they are at that side of things?
It seems to me there are only two groups that really have an interest in maintaining the drug war. One is the people who make money selling drugs, and the other is the people who make a living prosecuting drug cases and investigating drug cases.
Make a living at that.
Oh, sure. I had an interesting conversation with a drug enforcement agent not so long ago, in which I began, we were just waiting in a room for a client to be delivered, and I said, are we ever going to win this war on drugs? And with no sense of irony whatever, he looked at me and said, I don't want to win it, I just want to keep fighting it.
Wow, yeah, it's where the bread is buttered, right?
It kind of sums it up.
Or it's an, oh yeah, okay.
I would say that it's not too facile to say that, in a sense, we have created an industry. Drugs themselves are inexpensive items.
Yeah.
By prohibiting them and imposing a very severe enforcement system on them, we have created an industry, and we have made it a very lucrative industry, and we have given a monopoly in that industry to the people we are most afraid of. If, for example, an individual says, you know, I could make a little money, I could make $100 selling a drug. And if I get caught, the worst that'll happen to me is I'll do 30 days in jail. Person might do it. It's a rational judgment. Now, suppose you say to that person, you're not going to get 30 days, you're going to get 5 years in prison. That person may say, I'm not going to do it.
Draconian, yeah.
Just not going to do it.
Right.
But somebody will say, I will. That person is a person who's far more dangerous, it seems to me, to the society than the person who says, I'm not willing to do that. The second person is less thoughtful. Our policies tend to work like Darwinian laws. We have evolved towards more and more dangerous people taking over this business because there's a great deal of money to be gained in the business.
And as the sentencing becomes more mandatory, and so it goes that way, right?
It does. So the more seriously and severely we enforce the laws, the more punitive we are. We found from experience, this is not theory, we found from experience that there are always sufficient people to come in and take a chance to make the vast sums of money that are available. And as we ratchet up the severity of enforcement, the people who are willing to do it become people who are less concerned about their futures, more willing to be violent, more dangerous, more likely to be violent because they have more to lose. And so the business gets worse and worse, the business side of it.
And that's up the line, because there's people right on the street doing a small deal, and then there's up the line distributors and there's buyers. And the one thing you said in that, you said there's the people who are in the business of that, and then the people of enforcing it. That's a business, and you got all these. You probably got all kinds of nonprofit groups and everything who are making their way by doing
and housing them.
Yeah,
you talk about the prisons. It's one of the fastest growing industries. Is the prison industry.
Yeah, I saw in some of the literature they got these two really fast growing stocks. They're really growth stocks in building prisons for them and more, perhaps people and so forth. But then there's a question, maybe, I don't want to get, I mean, I could talk about that and everything, but more, there's the demand. There must be demand, for these things.
Surely.
Now, is there a point in trying to address it? Why is there such a demand for them? Because if the demand wasn't there, and if the people would just say no, and enough people said no, then the demand would go away. That's the thinking, I suppose.
Well, a lot of people do say no.
Yeah.
I mean, the vast majority of people say no.
But is it worth investigating, or important for us or you and I to talk about? Why is there such a demand for drugs? What does it mean? And also, I just saw a caveat or a little side. There was a piece in the paper recently is that we're talking about people who are, in a certain sense, becoming dysfunctional in the society. There's also a reaction to it where they had an article where any sporting event where the person gets achieves a new record or something, immediately the assumption is on all fields of sports and athletics is that they're on some sort of an enhancing thing, steroids or some sort of enhancing drug, and that the idea of sportsmanship is being violated by people who are using drugs not to be less effective, but in a certain sense, at least in the achievement of a particular goal, to become more effective in terms of what it is they're doing. And is that an issue that's worth discussing?
Well, interestingly, my own view is that the one area that I can think of where prohibition really would work or should work and make sense is in the area of sports, because if you don't vigorously enforce a ban on all performance-enhancing drugs, then the nature of competition more or less requires that everybody start to do it.
What's the difference between that and the rock business, or jazz business, or lawyering, or stockbrokering, or anything else in the society that is inherently competitive?
Well, because I don't think it's so. I don't think we can say that drugs are performance enhancing in such a narrow way in other competitive areas. In terms of building muscle mass, that's sort of a very narrow, specific use that may show itself. Presumably, it does, or they wouldn't be doing it. In terms of shaving off seconds or increasing or adding pounds.
Yeah, but the principle, whether is rather than thinking of drugs as just being inherently because we have. if I may, that same interview you did with Timothy Leary, he said that they're coming so fast. Now they're coming with what they call designer drugs. And we now understand the DNA. Not DNA, but so much the neurotransmitters. We understand what consciousness itself is. We can mimic states of consciousness and so forth. And there seems to be this tremendous appetite for people to have some alternative consciousness to that which they have by what they have in a certain sense genetically been given, and mix that in with their life experience. They want something different or something.
I think we all do. I think we all do. Not necessarily through drugs. Meditation, spiritual involvement. I think when people sing gospel songs, they create from themselves what is in effect a different state of consciousness. Other traditions chant. People who love to run. I can't get up in the morning at 5 o'clock and run 5 miles, but people who do it say that they feel good doing it.
Yeah, they get the endorphins going and everything like that. But should we? I mean, what I'm trying to do is follow through. Maybe it's illogic, it doesn't make sense or something like that. Should we, if we're against the altered state, should we then ban running? Because it creates an altered state, or should we? I'm getting absurd. You understand?
But I think that's
or to bring it back to it, that people who want to have some sort of an altered state maybe ought to be able to have an altered state if they want to.
I think that's right.
Why not?
I think that's right. I think we demonize that. We're afraid of that.
Yeah. Why?
I don't know why.
Okay. I mean, is it important? Do you think?
I think it is.
Try and get at that question?
I think it is. I don't. It's not something that I understand. I would say that people are not afraid of altered states. They're afraid of someone else's altered state.
That's interesting, isn't it?
They're not afraid of their own.
That's great stuff for scapegoating, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. There have also been things that are going to be done. We had done some time ago. Marilyn Mock-Volsavant. She's the most intelligent person in the world. You know, an IQ of 230 odd or something like that. But there are things that are going to enhance genetic engineering. It's another issue. It's coming. It's a side issue and everything like that. But they're going to be able to enhance intelligence by intervention within what nature gives. I mean, we come out of nature, and now we have all these technological capabilities. And if I may, I don't want to get far afield, but Mr. Leary, when we did the thing with him, he thought that the transformation of consciousness and capability and the human condition that the technology is bringing, and the effects of the technology on consciousness and the alteration of our mental processes and so forth, is far more important than the drugs. He saw just as the tip of the iceberg, or the frosting on the cake, as it were, that there's a larger transformation that's going on that might create free-floating angst about this transformation. We're going through some sort of a technologically based alteration.
Well, could we imagine
and
that
the
somebody...
drugs become a convenient scapegoat for that larger free-floating angst, do you think?
I think that may be so.
The existential problem that people feel.
Suppose we hypothesize a machine that somebody invents that generates a certain frequency sound, and it
makes people feel good.
It makes people feel the same way that people feel if they drank 2 glasses of wine or smoked marijuana. Or
should we ban it?
What do we do with that?
Right,
How do we understand that? I think one of the things that we have to confront is that people haven't thought this through that way. I have a notion, I call it a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, where people are, suppose, for example, we could produce, and we can't. I mean, this is not how biochemistry works.
This is only a conversation. So we can talk
we
about things.
We can invent anything.
Sure, we can just talk about something. Yeah.
Suppose we could invent a pill that a person could take. It changes their consciousness in any particular way.
Yeah.
It mimics heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, whatever it is.
Mr. Leary told me they had one where you could just 2 martinis and you don't have any of the side effects, and it's a drug.
Okay.
And let's say these guys are coming up with it all the time.
Let's say it comes with a second pill, an antidote, which when you take it, it absolutely eliminates the effects, and you're back to where you were.
Right.
So that when the lunch whistle blows at 12 o'clock, you can take the pill, and at 1 o'clock, when the call to come back to the factory is out there, you take the second pill, and you're back to normal, and you're on the floor of the factory, and you have no issues of causing an industrial danger.
Right.
What would be the attitude of society as to whether it would be permissible? Would it be permissible in a person's own house? I don't. My sense is most people would say no. Most people would say as they talked about it, it's wrong.
Uh-huh.
It's immoral
Yeah.
in some sense.
Mhm.
And they don't make a connection between how they may choose to change their own state of mind. As they say, when people participate, when people go to movies, when people chant, meditate, sing gospel songs.
Yeah.
And these have psychotropic effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Living, breathing, yeah. If you
So-
breathe in a certain way, yeah.
So I don't think
Yeah.
we're afraid of our own consciousness.
Right.
We're afraid of others.
Right, right.
So I think that's part of the problem. To get a little bit more down to earth in terms of our drug policy, I think the answer has to be more and better education. We now have a generation that's been subjected to the most intense kind of, it's called education. I think education overstates what it is. The people who've been subjected to DARE and those programs. There's a lot of literature that seems to indicate that DARE is not only ineffective in the older years, but counterproductive. In the
What
younger
is
years
DARE?
it works.
I'm sorry.
The drug abuse education.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, right, right.
Basically it's police going into schools and talking to the kids about the dangers of drugs. The problem is that it's not honest education, and kids are very attuned to
Yeah.
what is dishonest.
Yeah.
And so I think if we were able to provide honest education, honest information, people would make better judgments for themselves. And one of the things we lose in this severe policy environment, where it's just say no, where any deviation from that lands you in prison, where there is no discussion about whether the policies work or what the adverse consequences are, the consequence of that is that we don't have honest education, and people can't make good judgments for themselves.
And these are tied into broader issues, and it might be that we're coming to a time of a sort of a qualitative transformation. All right, there's a tremendous potentiality the new technologies have and so forth, but that creates an angst that's free-floating. If you find a focus for that, you're in real deep trouble. It seems to me drugs have become that focus, and that's something that we ought to, we really have to look at it, because it's very, very dangerous to the civic society and to the notion of freedom. And if there's, I'm glad you're keeping track of that, and I want to congratulate you very much.
Thank you
having
very
done
much.
that, begin some dialogues. There should be more dialogue on this issue, more discussion, as you say, in a reasonable.
We
kind
shouldn't
of
be
context.
afraid of real discussion.
Yeah, we should have real discussion and bring it up, because it's a very important subject, and it's tearing apart in a certain sense. In many people's view, the society we ought to be talking about. It's been your pleasure to have again the perception. Sorry, we could go on hours, but it's of Charles Adler, and he is the president of the Voluntary Committee of Lawyers here in New York City. And Charles, thank you really very much for coming into Manhattan
Good to be
Network.
with you.
Maybe this should be the beginning of many more conversations, and many other people engaging in conversations on this particular
I hope so.
subject, and not let it all just drift downstream as it's been doing. And too many people of responsible position haven't been taking a position on it, because maybe the way they never would speak up against McCarthy back in those days. Maybe it's beginning to turn now. Okay, it's been your pleasure to have his perceptions. We're in conversation. Soon we'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. Thanks again, Charles, once again for coming in. Until next time then. Thank you. So it's a huge, seamless web of a subject. It just goes into everything. I'm really pleased, you're taking that upfront position like that, you know.
I'm afraid we hardly touched the issue. The time went by so quickly.
Yeah. What major thing did we miss that we should have said?
I can't.
I know, it's hard.
There are so many. There
Yeah.
are just so many.
Uh-huh.
It has distorted our foreign policy in very important ways.
Right.
I don't know that I wish we had mentioned. I had mentioned the fact that the consequences of the prison industrial complex
Yeah.
is that places like New York and the inner cities are feeding